that's a great segue to Dr. Paul Matter, who's the CEO and co-founder of Power to Hydrogen. The company is focused on the commercialization of systems for hydrogen generation and energy storage. So I think that's you're taking the ball and running with it for both of our first two speakers, Paul. So I appreciate that, and I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Rob. Appreciate it. It's great to be back here at the Wall Street Green Summit. I wasn't sure if I'd be invited back after last year's talk where I used a lot of math. So I do promise to cut back on that this year. But Power to Hydrogen. So
hey, you know, you're back. Everybody needs the math. You know, it's all education, always learning, right? Yeah, always learning.
Just a little bit this year. So Power to Hydrogen, we're making advanced electrolysis and reversible fuel cell systems that can be used for energy storage. We have projects with NASA through the Tipping Point program. NASA is interested in reversible fuel cell systems for use on for remote energy storage, like on the lunar surface. We have funding from Shell, developing advanced hydrogen generation products, and a strategic partnership working on transportation applications. Just to let you guys know where we are right now, we've demonstrated our first stack prototype recently and are working now on a system that will demonstrate all of our value proposition, with plans to do pilots in 2023 and have commercial systems on the market by 2024. Last year, I talked a lot about how hydrogen doesn't have an efficiency problem, particularly for long duration energy storage. If you want to learn more about that, I'm not going to talk about it today, but it is on last year's video on YouTube. Also have a LinkedIn article about it if you prefer to read about it. On LinkedIn, it's published there. Today, though, I really want to focus on the future of hydrogen and how hydrogen is going to reach parity with fossil fuels and what Power Hydrogen is doing to help with that. So really, the first thing that helps to kind of understand where hydrogen is going is to look at DOE's, Department of Energy's Earthshot program, where they have established some goals for hydrogen prices. The goals they have is $2 per kilogram of hydrogen by 2026, and $1 per kilogram hydrogen by next decade. And so the motivation for those price targets are currently gray hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced from natural gas and releases carbon dioxide. That costs about $2 per kilogram. So if green hydrogen can reach $2 per kilogram, that's the first step. It can be a direct replacement for gray hydrogen, because once you have the hydrogen, there's no difference between green and gray hydrogen. It's just where it came from.
Hey, Paul, just for those of us on the audience who aren't as well varied in the color coding system of hydrogen, could you give a quick brief on that? Yeah, so I should point that out. Green hydrogen is hydrogen that is generated through electrolysis from 100% renewable energy. There's also blue hydrogen, which is generated from fossil fuels, but the carbon dioxide is captured. And then gray hydrogen, which is generated from natural gas, but the carbon dioxide produced is just released to the atmosphere. So currently, gray hydrogen is used for making things like chemicals, fertilizers is a big one, and also for upgrading of fuels, like even gasoline and reducing sulfur in gasoline. And so that is the first step. You can easily replace those applications. You can use green hydrogen instead of the gray hydrogen. So that's kind of the first step where hydrogen is going. The second step, though, is to get to $1 per kilogram of green hydrogen. And that allows you, at that price, now you can start to replace things like natural gas and fossil fuels directly for applications like heating, other industrial applications like high temperature furnaces, and then eventually even transportation, such as heavy duty vehicles, trains, ships, and applications like that where diesel fuel is used. So the question becomes, how do you really get to these price targets, particularly the $1 per kilogram, which is pretty challenging. There's really three things you need to understand about what makes up the price of green hydrogen. It's the cost of the electricity that you're using to make it. It's the cost of the equipment that's being used to make it, and then the distribution of the hydrogen. Those are really the three main components, and they're all interrelated. So looking first at the cost of the electricity, to really get down to $1 per kilogram of hydrogen using electrolysis, you need to have electricity that's at about 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And right now, renewable energy is actually around, on average, 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So we're not there yet.
but the price is coming down. It's probably not going to get to 2 cents per kilowatt hour though on average. But the thing you have to realize with renewable energy is that's an average price. So when you have more and more renewable energy attached to a grid, you're going to have periods in time where you have excess renewable energy. So it will be sold for less than 5 cents. And you have periods in time where you are short on renewable energy and it's going to be more expensive. So it comes out that about 30 to 40% of the time, you can get a renewable energy for less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour or less. So the caveat there is, and how this relates to the equipment, is you need to have equipment that can turn on quickly and capture and use the electricity when it's at a low cost, when it's abundant. And so there's different types of electrolyzer technologies out there. The most established is liquid alkaline electrolyzers that have been around for 100 years. The problem though there is they cannot turn on quickly. They prefer to operate at steady state at a constant current generating hydrogen. So they're not well suited for following, the load profile that would be required to capture low cost renewable energy. The types of electrolyzers that do a good job of following the load are membrane based. And the primary one being commercialized right now is proton exchange membrane electrolyzers. They're very good at following the load. The challenge they have though is they use expensive materials, particularly platinum and iridium in their electrodes. So they have the potential to meet the DOE's cost targets of about $100 per kilowatt to enable $1 per kilogram green hydrogen. But there's a challenge with the availability, particularly of iridium, that may prevent that. So what we're working on at Power to Hydrogen is an alkaline-based electrolyzer, but it uses a membrane. So essentially it allows the technology to follow the renewable loads, but it doesn't require any of this iridium that's very expensive, and the scarcity may make it impossible to make a product that's low cost enough. We're also developing the reversible systems so that instead of having a system that only operates 30% of the time, we can do electrolysis when the electricity prices are low, but then when there's a need for more energy, you run the system in reverse and generate electricity and sell it back to the grid for a profit. So that's how we're going to help basically get the clean hydrogen, green hydrogen down to $1 per kilogram. Now, the third thing I mentioned was distribution. Right now, distribution isn't a problem for many of the applications where green hydrogen is being installed, because if it's installed at the point of use on site, then you don't really have any distribution costs. But eventually, there's desire to use hydrogen to help decarbonize heavy duty applications. And so there you do need to distribute the hydrogen in many cases. And you need to get it to be less than about 25 cents per kilogram, which is a challenge right now because it's over $1 a kilogram in many cases to truck in hydrogen. Now, the problem, or the way that's being solved, is that hydrogen trucks right now store the hydrogen at about 200 atmospheres of pressure. So there are companies developing essentially carbon fiber trucks that can store hydrogen 4 times higher than that. And just by basically being able to fit more hydrogen on a single truck, you can cut that cost down dramatically. So that's one way the distribution cost is being solved. But ultimately, it's going to be solved through the use of pipelines. And I think Brian Pivovar from NREL gave a recent talk about this. He did analysis on the cost to distribute hydrogen in pipelines. And he looked at, for instance, a 20-inch pipeline, which is the same type of pipelines that are used to transport natural gas through interstate pipelines today. A 20-inch hydrogen pipeline transports effectively 90 gigawatts of power. And so if you compare that to the electrical transmission, the high voltage electrical transmission lines that you see along the highway, those are about 1 gigawatt. So a single hydrogen pipeline is about 90 times more power than the overhead electrical high voltage lines. And so on a cost basis, a pipeline is about 10 times less expensive than trying to transmit electricity over long distances. And that's how natural gas is transported today. So that's really ultimately where hydrogen will go, is you can transport it through pipelines. And in addition to transporting that power, it also is providing storage as well, because the pipeline has a decent amount of volume of hydrogen in there. But there's going to be stepping stones probably to get there. And so what's really starting to be adopted now is actually blending of hydrogen into existing natural gas pipelines. And that's something that can very easily be done. You can add about 10 or 20% hydrogen to the natural gas without really affecting anything. Now, above that, you're going to have to start retrofitting components such as like the gas turbines and furnaces to really be able to go above the 10 or 20% hydrogen limit. But that's probably the next step. And then eventually there will be dedicated hydrogen pipelines, because there is going to need to be additional infrastructure if we're going to decarbonize all of these economies, all of the economy, particularly some of these areas like heavy duties and industries. So that's kind of where we see things going. Eventually, you know, we are looking initially though at applications where we have smaller systems that are placed on site and you don't need the pipelines, and they could potentially produce hydrogen at very high pressure, so you don't even need to compress it and worry about the maintenance involved with that. So that's you know, kind of where we see hydrogen going. At Power to Hydrogen, you know, as I mentioned, just to reiterate, we're developing low-cost electrolyzers and reversible fuel cell systems that can handle the intermittent power demands of renewable energy grids. And we are using systems that aren't going to be relying on scarce elements that could present a cost problem in the future. We're looking at doing pilots of these in 2023 and commercial systems by 2024, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about it or any general questions about hydrogen.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate that, and glad to hear you're making such great progress on your own company. And Martin Bernstein had this question on leakage in H2 pipelines, and I was about to just bring up on the pipeline question on displacement. Is this something that is essentially with some modifications plug and play into existing pipeline infrastructure, or is this something that needs a new build and can't really take over some of those assets if we're talking about displacing natural gas?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something, you know, the natural gas companies are looking into, because there's some question about, like, for instance, welds and how they will hold up if you have a higher concentration of hydrogen, with hydrogen embrittlement. Depends a lot on pressure and hydrogen concentration. You know, that's why there's kind of this 10 to 20% we know is safe, but beyond that, it's still is going to take some more studies to figure that out. But yeah, there probably will be new builds though involved as well, just because if we're decarbonizing, you know, things like where diesel fuel is used, you're going to need new pipelines to distribute the energy. So I think there's definitely going to be some blending of hydrogen. It may not be able to get beyond 10 or 20% without new builds. So.
Before we move on to the next question, the blending side made me think of corn ethanol and how we're essentially forced to do that with probably minimal benefit, if anything. You know, so from your standpoint, one thing that maybe is not clear for me or for the rest of the audience, where's the upside of blending the natural gas with 20% hydrogen, say, in an existing pipeline or delivery system?
Yeah, so you can burn the hydrogen just like you're burning natural gas to generate heat. And so the thing is that now instead of releasing CO2, you're only releasing water. So essentially the fuel is cleaner if that hydrogen is green hydrogen, you know, coming from renewable energy. And then just on the renewable energy side, it gives you something to use that excess energy when you're generating too much solar, too much wind. You can put it into making hydrogen something that's useful rather than just wasting, you know, the asset and not doing anything with the electricity. So it helps to, you know, helps the renewable energy work and use that excess energy.
That makes sense. And, you know, it sounds like it's definitely more useful or productive than perhaps corn ethanol blends in the wintertime or what have you, based on what I've read. And it looks like Connor Ross has a question more on the storage side for you, or either for you, for your firm, or what you're seeing on broadly in the industry on whether it's compressed, underground, and any thoughts that you've seen on that. I mean, aside from transportation is in of itself kind of essentially a storage market, but any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so definitely, like underground storage, like salt caverns, that's how natural gas is stored today. And I think that makes a lot of sense for hydrogen, just because the cost to store hydrogen in geological features like that, it's less than $1 per kilowatt hour. So if you think a battery, typically you're talking $100 or $200 per kilowatt hour. So you could store a massive amount of energy in salt caverns, and for instance, generate hydrogen during the summer, save it, and then use it in the winter, just like basically how natural gas is used today. It's stockpiled and then used for the winter when it's cold to generate heat. So I think that makes a lot of sense for, if hydrogen is being generated on site, you're still going to have some storage. For stationary applications, really the industry's kind of going towards about 30 bar, or about 450 to 500 PSI pressure just in steel tanks. Seems to be an acceptable way to store it. It's effective. And again, on a cost basis, it's more $10 to $20 per kilowatt hour. So much less than a battery, but not as good as if you had a geological feature to store it in.
That compression price or rate, that's far lower or cheaper than natural gas, compressed natural gas, correct?
Well, I mean, yeah, so that's about, the pressure you're talking about in your natural gas pipeline to your house. But now if we're talking about transportation applications, that's where you need the very high pressure to get the energy density. So that's where you're going to 350 bar or 700 bar. And typically that would be done with, if you have the storage at 30 bar, then when you're ready to fill the vehicle, you have a boost compressor that takes it all the way up into pressure and puts it in a carbon fiber tank that's on the vehicle. But we're also working on some advanced electrolyzer concepts where we can do the electrolysis directly to 350 bar, for instance. And our NASA project, we're going to 250 bar directly from the electrolyzer. And you can do that if you know the hydrogen is only going to be used for a vehicle. You might as well generate it at the highest pressure possible from the electrolyzer.
Got it. All right, so our last question is also going to set up our next speaker. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you see that might be limiting the scale up of green hydrogen? You've touched on it a little bit, but anything else beyond that you want to leave with us besides the cost targets and some of the other things that you see as a challenge, and maybe with the way your firm is addressing it, or some of the most promising opportunities for scaling the technology?
Yeah, so definitely the challenges with the cost, and also I didn't touch on it too much, but a lot of these cost assumptions assume the equipment is going to last, at least 10 years, ideally 20 years. Our firm hasn't been around that long. So the way we're addressing it is we're designing the systems to be able to easily swap out components and refurbish components. So it's not a huge cost hit if we don't have the reliability to a point where it's bankable yet, where if it's easy to replace and refurbish, then there's not as much worry about that. I'm buying an expensive piece of equipment that might break down and need to be replaced in 2 or 3 years. So that's the strategy we're taking there, is just to try to leverage as much as already been demonstrated with liquid alkaline, and then our new components, they're easily refurbished or replaced.